Good evening, everyone. I'm Trey Johnson, and welcome to our monthly lecture series, Museum After Hours. Tonight, Christine Steinkuhler will be talking to us about the Carnegie-funded libraries across the state of Kansas. Steinkuhler gained a BA in History and a teaching license from Washburn University and her MA in Special Education from Emporia State. She's an avid historian, freelance writer, president of the Shawnee County Historical Society, and the Topeka Landmarks Commissioner. Christine also serves as the gifted facilitator and scholarship coordinator for the Topeka West High School. She's previously served on the Kansas Historical Society's board. This evening, Steinkuhler will be focusing on the Scottish-American businessman and philanthropist Andrew Carnegie, who immigrated to the United States with his parents at the age of 13. From humble beginnings of working long hours at a cotton mill, Carnegie's ambitions and love for learning gained him great wealth. He believed anyone with access to books and the desire to learn could educate themselves and be successful as he had been. He used his wealth to establish many colleges, schools, nonprofit organizations, and trusts across the country and beyond. Carnegie donated more than $55 million to create over 2,500 libraries and communities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Tonight, Steinkuhler will highlight the roughly 60 Carnegie-funded libraries across Kansas. After the presentation, we'll have a question and answer session, so please use the chat or Q&A feature to type in your questions for our speaker. So let's all welcome Christine Steinkuhler.
Hi, good evening. I'm going to start this a little non-traditionally, just because this wouldn't load up into my PowerPoint. But I started this project for one of my freelance writing gigs. And this is the map we created of the libraries in Kansas. And it was for Topeka Magazine. This does not include the one in Newton. There's always something that you miss, no matter how many times you look at this. And if you look at this map, some are little stacks of books, and those are the ones that are still in use of libraries. The number 2, that's actually supposed to be a screwdriver and a hammer, and that means that they have been remodeled, but they are still used as a library. The little mountain is still standing, but not a library. And then the little circle with a stem, that's not a cherry. That's actually kind of representing a demolition ball. And those libraries are not standing. If you will notice, the majority of the libraries are in the eastern part of the state, particularly the southeastern part of the state. My belief on that is Carnegie generally required 1,000 people to be in a city for them to qualify for a Carnegie library. And at the time he was giving away, these ended in 1919. I do not think that there were a lot of towns west of Salina that necessarily had 1,000 people. But that is just my theory. I have nothing to back that up. So now why are they concentrated in the southeast? At the time Carnegie started his libraries, a number of places already had a library. And cities like Topeka, some of the bigger cities already had a library. So they didn't necessarily ask for a Carnegie grant. But those are just some theories, and that's the map. If anyone wants it, it is reproducible, because it is kind of fun to go visit them all. Okay, just a second. I haven't done this in a while. Okay.
Do you need any help, Christine?
Oh, I think I'm going to be fine. It's just a matter of, I hate to say this, for a long time there, I was Zooming every day, all day, and now I'm not. Um, I think I have it. Sorry. So Carnegie, this is a picture of him. He is roughly about 60 in this picture. It's one of my favorite quotes. And he says this in response to people who are questioning his motivations and the library. I'm in the business of library manufacturing business and beg to be allowed to concentrate my time on it until it is filled. A timeline of Andrew Carnegie. In 1835, he is born in Scotland to a family of weavers. Interestingly, on his family side, both his mother and his father, he's had some activism. There are family members who are almost union members, but they question things. In 1848, basically weaving was going out. His father wove damask, and that was becoming a thing of the past. It was becoming mechanized. The Industrial Revolution was moving in. They moved to the United States. And he got his first job in 1849. In 1853, he gets his job at the Pennsylvania Railroad. And this is really a turning point because Carnegie, he was just very good at math and understanding things. In 1867, he founds the Keystone Bridge Work and he retires from the railroad. And his first donations begin, and he has no idea he's going to start the libraries at this point, with giving his hometown in Scotland a pool and a community center. He builds on this over the years. And then in 1875, he opens the Edgar Thomson Works, which is his first steel plant. What will define Carnegie is he hops onto the Bessemer steel process early on. And then in 1881, he begins doing library grants. The first of these, and the first six, and this is called the retail period, but the first of these is Allegheny. And the second is Braddock. Braddock is finished before Allegheny, but Allegheny is finished first. And these first six, he has personal connections with. They are with towns that he has steel mills in. In 1887, he lived with his mother until her death, and his mother dies and he marries Louise Whitfield. In 1889, he publishes kind of his treatise, The Gospel of Wealth. In 1892 is, of course, the Homestead Strike, which most people know is one of the defining strikes of the Industrial Revolution. In 1897, in terms of giving away libraries, he hires Bertram, and he changes the process for the libraries. This is when he is beginning to get out of being personally involved. In 1901, he sells out his business to J.P. Morgan. He is at this point the wealthiest man in the world, and the wholesale phase of the library building begins. And in 1911, he steps out of the library process entirely. And then in 1919, he dies. This is a picture of the library and the pool he donated in Scotland to his hometown. He donates quite a bit to his hometown. And something to remember about his hometown is he's donating a pool and baths. And at this time, a lot of people did not have running water in their houses. So when he's donating this, he is thinking of this as bathing facilities for people. He's not thinking of it, people think of it like Turkish baths, sort of. Not necessarily so much, maybe a little more practical. And this is the Allegheny Library, and you can see part of the interior of it. Now there were 14 buildings in total, 6 communities, and he spent almost 1.7 million. They were Allegheny, Pittsburgh, Braddock, and Homestead. And those were all places he had company affiliations. And then you have Johnstown. And Johnstown is where they have the Johnstown flood. That is a resort area, and you have a number of wealthy citizens who belong to the South Fork Club, and there's a beautiful lake there with a dam, and it floods, and the flood breaks the dam, and it floods the town. And even though his property was not directly on the lake, it was nearby, and he did belong to the South Fork Association that owned it, and he felt a responsibility. And at this point in time, he has a second home in Scotland, and he goes ahead and he raises money for the Johnstown flood in Scotland. This is Braddock, the first of his that he opens in the United States. It opens in 1889 at a cost of $357,000. It has indoor plumbing. It has a billiard hall. It is not just what we would consider a library. It has a gymnasium. It has a swimming pool. It has community rooms. It's really more of a community center. Now, this is just a little aside. I have a personal interest in hardware, and this is the doorknob from the Braddock Library. This doorknob first appears in that library. I do not know if Carnegie actually paid for it, if that was the original intent. Carnegie on his own buildings had a doorknob that had a C. It was very common to have personalized doorknobs at this point in time. And this is a portrait of his wife, Louise. And there is a picture of his house, which is on Central Park. It fundamentally takes up a block. It is a narrow block in the way it faces the park, but it is right there. And when he married Louise, he had a prenuptial agreement, and he agreed that she would have $3 million a year, and that would be it. And she went along with this idea. She never questioned it in court after he died. Carnegie, once he makes it, he really begins spending a lot of his time in Scotland. Initially, he rents someplace, but then he buys a castle and he tears it down, and this is what he builds, and the library in it. Moving on, this is the Johnstown Library that he built after the flood for the citizens of Johnstown, somewhat out of his guilt, maybe. It is now a museum to the Johnstown flood. And then after the Johnstown flood is when the Gospel of Wealth comes out. And he's been thinking about this, and he's in semi-retirement. And Carnegie comes to the idea that, the first part of your life should be spent working. And then the second part of your life, you should be spent on higher good. Kind of the idea of those with the most gifts have the most responsibilities. And that, once you accumulate your wealth, you give it away. And this is when he kind of formulates his plan that he will follow through with. He also believed that he knew how to spend the money better than others, and that was part of the reason he had been made wealthy. In the course of this, one of his first philanthropies really was the public libraries. He will go on to do a lot of other philanthropies. One of the more fun ones is a lot of churches were given organs by Carnegie, and Carnegie himself loved organ music and had an organist. But in total, he gives away almost 1,700 libraries to 1,400 communities. And about 750 of these libraries are still functioning as libraries. Worldwide, over 2,500, generally in English-speaking countries, and at a cost of $56 million. Just one of my favorite political cartoons of a Carnegie throwing away money. And Carnegie was a big believer in helping yourself. And one of the ways of helping yourself was self-education. And he had done it. And doing the libraries, he felt that people could learn and could improve themselves. So as I said, you have a period from 1881 to 1911 when Carnegie is actually still involved in the libraries. And then in 1911, he creates the Carnegie Corporation, which oversees the grants, and he is no longer at all involved. What is also interesting is the first phase of the libraries were endowments. They were not grants. So those libraries were given money to continue in perpetuity. Now, obviously, I don't think that lasted forever. Now, one of the things Carnegie insisted on with his libraries would they be tax supported. And this was a pretty radical idea. A lot of states had to pass legislation in order for this to happen. At the time Carnegie was giving away libraries were limited to white males. Most libraries were by subscription. This picture is actually a picture of one of the remaining subscription libraries in the United States. It's the Mercantile Library in Cincinnati, Ohio. There's about 18 of these left. But the most famous, of course, is in Philadelphia, and that was founded by Benjamin Franklin. Libraries at this time also typically banned children under 12, and women were relegated to reading rooms at certain sections of the libraries. So all this, Carnegie will turn on its head because Carnegie wants children in the library. That was part of the reason he wanted the basement, was that basement was to be a community room and to be for children. And he wanted everyone to come to the library. But he insisted that the libraries be tax supported, and he needed proof of that before he would give you a grant. And he needed proof that they would be open to the public. We did have a few ladies' libraries in Kansas. Blue Rapids was one, Kingman, Junction City, which still functions as a ladies' library. I have not made it there, but this is a picture of that library. And then Leavenworth Space Collection. Most libraries in the state of Kansas started with a women's group of some sort. Now, this is a picture of James Bertram. Carnegie starts out the first few by himself. Because remember, the first one's coming almost 10 years before he hires Bertram. But he hires a fellow Scotsman, James Bertram, in 1897. And James Bertram really becomes the guy who does the majority of the work on the libraries. He is the secretary to the Carnegie Corporation in 1911, and all plans after 1908 are submitted to him, and he keeps track of all the expenses on libraries, etc. And then right about 1908, before 1908, there was no plan for how libraries were built. But in 1908, he publishes the erection of library buildings, giving design advice. Now the process, how did you get a library? You make a request. Initially, Carnegie would take a request from anybody in the town. But as this proceeded, he realized that he needed to have some credentials. So he started asking for who people were. You had to be a city officer. A lot of the requests said, we desperately need a library because our town is full of vice. We have saloons, we have gambling, and we want to make our town a better, cleaner town. It's really surprising how many people in their letters to the Carnegie for a library claim some relationship to Carnegie or to Abraham Lincoln. I would say a full 20% of the ones I've read mention Lincoln, which is interesting. Carnegie did require that the city provide a site. This was one of the biggest disagreements in cities. And he generally wanted it to be a prominent site and to be a site that was centralized. And he required cities commit 10% annual match for maintenance. And he made people send in receipts that they actually did that. Grants were $2 per residence, and 1,000 people were needed to get a grant. And these did not include books, did not include furniture. It was just the physical building. This is basically, he had about 3 different schedules of questions, but this covers most of the questions. He asked the name of the town, the population. Did it have a library? in general, Carnegie wanted to see something. A lot of towns just had a bookshelf and they said the number of books. You know, they wanted to know where it was housed. You saw libraries housed everywhere: fire stations, brothels, grocery stores, a lot of variety in where the libraries were. Number of rooms, finances, could they afford the library? That was very important to him, because Carnegie was not paying to keep the library forever. He was just paying for the building. And would the municipality be willing to do a tax levy? He believed it was very important that it be a public expense and that everyone would bear the burden of a library. That was also very contentious in a number of areas. What's the highest tax rate that would be allowed, and how much income would this have to yield, and is the site available? And then he had a very simple contract. He agrees to furnish the library, you agree to do the tax and furnish the site. On the design of the library, Carnegie actually did not have any stipulations to the design. He had suggestions. He wanted a centralized librarian that could see everybody. He tended to favor buildings where you had a basement that was usable. That was kind of a cost-effective method. He wanted good air circulation. He wanted good light. He did only fund libraries that were masonry. All the libraries that are Carnegie libraries are stone or brick. He also preferred not to have shake shingles. He, in general, only funded libraries with slate or tile roofs, or metal. You do see some tin roofs, etc. But he was looking for something that was built to last. He was not into fancy particularly. If a town wanted fancy, they had to pay for them themselves, raise extra money. And a lot of towns did. The other way towns saved money, though, is you would see towns use the same plan as some other town had, use the same architect. These are drawings from Bertram's book, and many people will recognize these library configurations. But fundamentally, there were about 6 plans. But Bertram, it was not insisted upon that you follow them. And this is all during the wholesale period, which is 1898 to 1919, in which he gave 40 million to 1,400 communities. The community that received the most was New York City, with 72 libraries. Now, just some statistics. New York, not surprisingly, received the most. And by the number of libraries, Indiana received the most. Pennsylvania was second in terms of money, then Ohio, California, and Indiana. And the number of libraries, when I did this initially, it was very surprising to me. California was number 2. And then Illinois, Iowa, and Ohio. Kansas is not horribly far down this. Kansas is actually about number 15. Ohio has 77. Kansas has about 60. So the Kansas libraries, we have 58. And we had an additional 7 academic libraries, which are never included when talking about the libraries. And the academic libraries are the college libraries. And the grants totaled almost 900,000. So he gave away that much to the state of Kansas in 16 years. The only cities that applied for a library and didn't end up getting one were Frankfurt and Atchison. You know, the most common reason that a library was not given to a city was actually either a dispute over where placement was, or coming up with the funds. That, especially after World War I, that became a real problem. Just a little bit of Kansas library history. In 1886, and remember Carnegie starting the libraries in 1889, Kansas passes the legislation which allows libraries to be funded through tax dollars. 1899, Kansas has the Traveling Library Commission that delivers books to towns. 1900, Annie Diggs is the state librarian, and she organizes the Kansas Library Association, and she creates the state library in the Capitol building that we know of today with the glass floor. And then 1904, by that point, there are 39 tax-supported libraries in Kansas. Kind of fun, in 1904, this is what the Kansas Library Association recommended: general works, philosophy, religion, sociology, language, science, useful arts, literature, history, and fine arts. What we think of as fiction today was not very highly regarded at this point in time, and generally you didn't see a lot of it, although it was well liked. You also don't see children's books in this, and you don't see periodicals, which is interesting because periodicals are very popular at this time. Libraries also didn't typically carry newspapers at this time. So I have to go to one of our favorite sons, William Allen White, who says that everything begins in Kansas. And in a way, Carnegie and his libraries began in Kansas. Carnegie, when he was living in Pittsburgh and he was working, he had met Colonel James Anderson. Anderson had a library, about 400 volumes, that he allowed the working boys of the city to check out books one day a week. And that is a picture of Anderson and his house. And then this is a picture at the Allegheny Library of the statue in the fountain honoring Anderson. But Carnegie credited Anderson with helping him and helping other working kids. And Anderson, by the time Carnegie starts his library, Anderson has moved from Pittsburgh and he is living in Emporia, and he is one of the board members of the College of Emporia, which is a Presbyterian college there. And this is one of the few, Carnegie in general during the retail phase and with the academic libraries did not solicit anyone. You had to ask Carnegie for a library. He didn't ask you if you wanted a library. But Carnegie reached out to Anderson's widow, and he wanted to build a library. And so the library on the left-hand side is the library that was at the college, it still is, at the College of Emporia, in Emporia. And it was used by the College of Emporia until roughly they closed around the late 1970s. It was taken over for a while by the College of the Way, and currently it is empty and looking for opportunities. Beautiful building. And then on the other side, Emporia is one of the few towns that has two Carnegie libraries, and is the Carnegie Library, which was in downtown Emporia. Now, something Carnegie also did in his democratization and just changing the whole way we thought about libraries was being a librarian had not really been an occupation up to this point in time. But with Carnegie's libraries, you see librarians become a profession. And this is a profession that from the beginning is dominated by women. The first professional librarian in the state of Kansas was Miss Mary Cornelia Lee of Manhattan, and she had trained in Brooklyn, New York, and that is a picture of her. The Riley County Historical Society has some wonderful, wonderful pictures and documentations of their Carnegie. But so yes, she was the first professional librarian in Kansas. Now moving on, the demise of the library program, a lot of it was due to World War I. But you also had towns that were not fulfilling their promise to pay 10% per year toward the library. In Kansas, there was Caldwell, Cherryvale, Downs, Goodland, Lincoln, Osawatomie, Salina, and Lyons. And Bertram wrote to Governor Capper, and you can find in the archives of the state of Kansas the letters that Arthur Capper sent out to those cities asking them to pay their pledge. Now, fundamentally, was Kansas the cause of the demise of the library program? No, this was happening throughout the country where Carnegie had donated libraries. And since it had been taken over by the Carnegie Corporation, that board looked at the states that had the most defaults, one of which was Texas, and decided to visit those 3 states. And upon visiting those 3 states, decided to discontinue the library program. But by that point, Carnegie had achieved, I believe, what he fundamentally wanted to. And also in 1919, he dies. And this is looking at the libraries in Kansas. This is Abilene. It is funded by a women's club. One of the fun things is one of their fundraisers was speeches by William Jennings Bryan. It cost $12,500. One of the great collections they have is WPA dolls, which until Abilene's library, and this, I was not aware of the WPA doll project, but it is very much like the mural project. You do have to ask to see them. It was dedicated in 1908, and the architect was from Bloomington, Illinois. It is still in use, and these are some recent pictures of it. It has had an addition, which is not uncommon, but still a lot of original. Another of the libraries, Anthony, a $10,000 grant and in 1911. It has been vacant, and it was designed by an architect out of St. Louis. One of the fun things about Kansas is that Kansas has the number of libraries that claim to be the smallest library. This is pretty small at 56 by 50. Arkansas City, 18,000, and in 1808, it was replaced in 1980, and it stands vacant. Burlington, and you can see the postcard picture, which was done shortly after it was built, and then a picture of it actually a couple years ago. This is an office now, Mary Investments. It is kind of interesting the number of libraries that are no longer libraries that have become investment firms, because that's probably the most common use for ones that are no longer used as a library. And this was designed by George Washburn. He was one of the main architects of Carnegie libraries in the state of Kansas. Caldwell and the Caldwell Research Club raised this money for this and asked for it. It cost $7,000, and it is concrete block with a brick veneer. And so you don't see that a whole lot, and you can tell it's kind of later in the period. Kenton, once again, Literary Club, 6,000, and George Washburn. This is the last Carnegie library that was finished in the United States, and they started this one before World War I, and they finished it after. So it was fairly modest but plans earlier had been for a grander library, but shortages, etc. The library in Chanute, which is currently vacant and not publicly accessible, but definitely a beautiful building. And the tower has been removed. Cherryville, still a public library, $10,000 grant. And again, by George Washburn. An addition was done in the 1950s. Clay Center, still in use as a library. Quite remarkably, this one was hit by a tornado and they rebuilt. Coffeyville, $25,000 grant. And it is not a library anymore, and it was recently purchased, and I don't know what is going on with it now. If someone knows, I would be interested. Columbus, the Shakespeare Club built this one, and it was also George Washburn. It originally had an ivory collection, and it is still a library. Concordia. Concordia is now home to the Cloud County Historical Society Museum, and it was once again a ladies' club. Interesting, when it was built, it was visited by Jay Gould's daughter, who gave money for books there. In general, Jay Gould's daughter, any town that had received a library from Carnegie, she gave money to. She very often visited them. And he was with the Union Pacific. Council Grove, He was the U.S. House of Reps. Now, this one Carnegie was sort of involved with. Carnegie was at a dinner with Mr. Miller and talked to him about his work on the Panama Canal and got to talking about how their library had recently had a fire. And that is how they ended up with a new one. It is currently the Morris County Historical Society. Dodge City. It is currently the Art Center, another very common use for repurposed Carnegie libraries. And C.W. Squires of Emporia was the architect on this one, built for $8,500. Downs, this is still in use. And it was done by an Iowa architect. Once again, Miss Gould gave books to this library. El Dorado, this is kind of fun because we have a newspaper drawing of what they project the library to look like. You have the postcard, which is what it did look like when it was built. And then this is a photo I took a year or so ago of it. So it looks very much the same. And it was a library until roughly 1960. And then they built a new library. And this is now, I believe, a stock office. John Stanton was the architect. And William Allen White, who grew up in part in El Dorado, did donate a room to this. This is the Emporia Carnegie Library. It is currently vacant. Miss Amanda Witz was the librarian, and she was largely responsible for getting Emporia the Carnegie Library. It was replaced in 1979 with a new library next door. And this library, like so many, when it was being built, did have controversy over the site, and Senator Plum's wife's donation prevailed. Eureka, this is another George Washburn. It was replaced as a library and now as offices. Fort Scott. Fort Scott's library is still in use as a library. It has had an addition. Garden City. This took a while to go through. Garden City really didn't know if they wanted to spend the money on a library or, were there other things they should be doing. It was moved to a different building, and it is now actually a church. Girard is still in use as a library. It came to be kind of interestingly. Jane Addams was the sister of Mrs. Alice Haldeman. Mrs. Alice Haldeman, Julius Haldeman, and the Little Blue Book's mother. But Jane Addams came to visit Girard, and she brought up to the women's group that they did not have a library. And that was kind of the beginning of Girard getting a library. Goodland, the Goodland Carnegie Library is still there. It is also an art center. Goodland did have some talk in the paper about it being tainted money and about the Homestead strike. There wasn't a lot of that in Kansas, but Goodland was one of the places, which was kind of interesting because the other place that has this is, Southeast Kansas, and Goodland is quite a bit west. Great Bend. Great Bend is no longer there. It was demolished in 71. It had a leaking roof. And once again, it's Heron, Anderson, and Smith of Iowa. The second floor had an auditorium. Oh, and I'm going to go to questions real quick. I mentioned that some libraries had pool and much more. Those were the early builds. And were there any like that in the US? Yes, that first six, all six of those had pools and more. Well, excuse me, the one in Iowa didn't. The one in Iowa was an anomaly. I would have to look up when Miss Cornelia Lee became a librarian. And do the cities own the library buildings themselves? Yes, in general, they do. If they have been decommissioned as a library, not necessarily. But if they're still a library, yes. Halstead, Kansas, this was raised in 1972. They built a new library on that site. And once again, it's George Washburn as the architect. Hayes, this is a design that you see several of. It was repeated in different varieties. It was demolished, fundamentally kind of bad design or engineering. I hate to say that, but the second floor was sagging due to the weight of the books. And my guess from reading is that once again, that second floor, when it was originally built, was thought to be a meeting room. Carnegie was very big on the libraries having meeting room capacities. So as a meeting room ballroom, but as they had more demand for books, they began using the second floor for books, and that second floor was not designed for that use. But so it was demolished in 68 and a new library was built. Harrington, just so unusual for this period, but it was built and one of the fundraisers was women's baseball games. A little known fact is actually at this point in time, there were actually women's professional basketball teams from town teams, like town baseball teams. You had town basketball teams, but I hadn't heard of women's baseball games being used for fundraisers. And is still in existence. Hiawatha. Now, Hiawatha is still in use, and Hiawatha had a library that Governor Morrill had started, and this was kind of an extension to it. And Hiawatha had a brick plant, and that's where the bricks came from. It had a major addition and renovation. Hutchinson, this is an unusual design, and it was decommissioned as a library in 46, and the Union bought it. The Union currently still owns it, and they use it as storage. And it is another Squires building. Independence, this was the first library to be air conditioned, so a big deal. And it cost $22,000. It took several years to pass the tax. And I presume that this was the idea that you have the water tower that drops the water to do the air conditioning. Iola, this is one of the few that is once again made out of concrete and is faced in stone. It was Heron Smith, and it was raised in 65 for a new library to be built on the site, a larger library. Kansas City, Kansas, Maine. Kansas City, Kansas, one of the other cities to have two. The Maine was very unusual in the amount of land it sat on, and it was surrounded by formal gardens with fountains. You can kind of see it in the lower postcards. And it had the ballroom or meeting room on the second floor. So not just a library. And it cost $75,000. It was the second most expensive in the state of Kansas. The other Kansas City library was, of course, kind of to serve the railroad, and it's the Argentine branch. It is still standing, but it is not a library. And it had issues with flooding. It did flood in 51 and had some water issues. Kingman, still a library, $10,000 grant, and Fred McCune of Wichita builds that. Lawrence. Lawrence opens, and in 1970, a new library was built, and it was turned into an art center and is now an event space. The unusual thing about Lawrence, and there's a picture of Lawrence on the outside and then the interior, is Lawrence is the same design as the one in Beatrice, Nebraska. But Beatrice, Nebraska, the outsides are identical, but the interiors are different. And this was a way of saving money on your design, was to use the same architect. Leavenworth, Kansas was the first of the Carnegie libraries in Kansas. 1986, they built a new library for more space, and this was broken up into apartments. It is still standing and in use as apartments. Lincoln, Kansas, it's still a library. It was a $6,000 grant, one of the small ones. Linden, Kansas, another one of the small ones that claims to be the smallest, but I don't actually think it is. It opened in 1911. It is still working as a library. You can see I was there recently, and that's a picture of the librarian. They have recently done a renovation, and it is doing very well. Lyons, Kansas is a museum. It hasn't been a library since 1971. Manhattan's library which is part of kind of their city complex on the square, is still in use. It is a city building, but it has had significant alterations. But as I said, the Riley County Historical Society does have a wealth of photographs and information on it. McPherson, this was all caused by Mrs. Miller, who came from a town that had a library and moved to McPherson that did not have one. And well, she had to do something about that. It was raised in 1970 for a new, larger library. Newton's is still standing. It became the Harvey County Historical Society in the 1970s, and Rose of Kansas City was the architect. And so, kind of interesting though, this is one of the few libraries in Kansas where there was already a library tax in existence before the Carnegie, and their first library tax was in 1886, which is quite a bit before Carnegie started. The Olathe Library, which has been demolished, and it was designed by Professor Walters from K-State. It was one of the libraries that was lost to urban renewal. Osawatomie is George Washburn. Once again, one that was demolished due to urban renewal. Osborne, Kansas, is now the Historical Society. And this was one in which women, even though they weren't allowed to vote throughout, they voted in this election. They were allowed to. And it is identical to the Stockton Library. Once again, saving your fees on the architect. Oswego, just one of those great small libraries, still in use. Ottawa, it is now an art center. And George Washburn was the architect. E.F. Parker was the architect. And this library was going to fall due to urban renewal, and a group of concerned citizens prevented its demolition, and it is now an art center. Peabody. Peabody is probably one of my favorites in the state. You know, they had a $10,000 grant, and Peabody is a pretty small town. It was one that there's always been some talk. Did they, you know, how wide a circle did they range to get their 1,000 people? But they got their 1,000 people, and this is their library. There's some pictures of the interior. In my opinion, it is the most intact of the Carnegie libraries in the state. As you can see, the original bookshelves are all still there. And the table that I have a picture of is one of the original tables in the children's section. And then in the lower corner, there's a postcard of it when it opened originally. This is actually, Peabody has a great history. And this is a picture of Peabody's first library. And it was the first tax-supported library in Kansas in 1874. And that was because the ATSF, Santa Fe, came in. And Peabody wanted a library in his town. And that is the picture of the wood there. That is not a floor. That is the ceiling in that original library. And that original library, which you can, I don't know if you can tell from the photo, but it sits directly behind the new Carnegie Library, and it is now their Historical Society Museum. The Pittsburgh Library. This is actually the only place where you really see the Homestead strike come out in Carnegie's giving in Kansas. And the miners in Pittsburgh did oppose having a Carnegie Library. The controversy was settled with, it would not look like a traditional Carnegie Library. They would not have Carnegie's name, but they would take the library. And it is still in use. It has been remodeled, but that is really the only one where you see a controversy in the paper about potentially being blood money. Plainville, this was raised for a new library, and it opened in 1912. Russell, demolished in 1962 for a larger library. And as you can tell, this is very similar to the design of the Hayes Library. The Salina Library was raised in 68. Sterling, it is still a library. It has had a significant addition. And George Washburn was the architect. Stockton. Now, this is where we have another library in town in the state that is a match to it. It is still a library. Washington, Kansas, it was raised in 1975 for another bigger library. And this postcard, just as a side note, came from Zurcher of Topeka. Zurcher's didn't have many library postcards, so it's kind of interesting. Zurcher was one of the early real photo postcard manufacturers, and people could send in pictures and he would make your picture a photograph. So you don't know if Zurcher took the picture himself or if this was one he was commissioned to make a postcard for. Wellington, still in use. It has been expanded. Wichita, Wichita is one of the most expensive, same cost as the one in Kansas City, although on a smaller plot of land. Anyhow, Wichita had quite a controversy because the librarian disagreed with Mrs. Murdoch, and this is Benton Murdoch, he owns the paper, over the interior design and the design of the library. And the librarian ends up resigning due to this. Mrs. Murdoch is ill and she will die shortly after the completion of the library. But Mrs. Murdoch did end up getting the final say in the design. The sunflower is a picture of the featured logo and the stained glass there. It was designed by A. Cromwell of Wichita. And it was decommissioned as a library, I'm going to say in the 1970s, and it was the Adventure Center and a number of other things. And then about 10 years ago, Fidelity Bank took it over and they did just a tremendous restoration and renovation. And it is now a Fidelity Bank building. It is generally not open to the public, but you can make an appointment and go see it. But just a great success story of a reuse. The Winfield Library, and I believe it is still a library. I'm not absolutely positive, and if someone out there knows for sure, I haven't been to visit absolutely all of them. This is the Yates Center Library, which is the same design as the one in Hayes, and it is still in use as a library. And then we have the academic libraries. Don't know why he didn't call them college libraries, but they are at colleges. And the National Register nomination includes 4 of the academic libraries. Carnegie built 108 of these across the nation, 7 of which are in Kansas. And the academic libraries had different criteria. They were required just a straight 1,000 a year. This is the one at the College of Emporia when it was first built, and that is the dedication plaque to John Anderson. And if you go up into the top of this library, every graduating class from the College of Emporia signed that dome. Kind of fun. This is the one at Baker University, which is still in use as classrooms. It's known as Case Hall now. This is the one at Bethany. It was raised. Fairmont College, this was in Wichita, and it had a fire. There are 3 columns from it still standing on the campus of Wichita State University. This is McPherson's library, which was raised. Midland College in Atchison, and this one has also been raised. Washburn's is really quite a story. Washburn's was, of course, built in 1905, and it was damaged as part of the 66 tornado, and that's what that upper picture is. And Washburn decided to renovate it, and they completely restored the exterior of it. The interior was not the same, but until just this past year in the basement, it had the library for the education department. Currently, it is not open to the public, but it is under renovations and it is returning to use as an archival library. But one of the really just amazing stories is, I maybe should go back, but the library lost all its windows during the tornado. And about 3 years ago, there was a couple, the Cottrells, who lived in Topeka, who bought that stained glass window, which is just pictured, at a garage sale. And they had it in their house for a number of years, and they didn't realize what it came from. And it came to their knowledge that it came from the Carnegie Library. And so they, about a year ago, returned that window to Washburn University. But that window somehow survived the '66 tornado. And below is a picture of the reading room at the Carnegie Library on Washburn's campus. So that kind of concludes it. Questions?
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Christine. Let's see. Susan asks, do the cities own the library buildings themselves?
They did. They do not all necessarily anymore. If it's been decommissioned as a library, generally they don't.
Okay. So, I mean, a lot of these buildings don't exist anymore. Is there anything that we can do to help preserve them, help keep them around?
Well, something to always be aware of is adaptive reuse. They really work well as offices. There is one in Canada that has been turned into a private home. And the other thing is you can work with your preservation planner and with the State Historical Society. And there are ways to put in elevators. Goodland has a neat little example. I didn't have a picture of it, but that can be done to make it ADA compliant. I would recommend talking to your preservation planner or to KSHS and talking to an architect who does that kind of work. But yeah, they're very, I mean, I hate to say it, not only are they just physically attractive, Carnegie wanted a well-built building. They're masonry and they have tile or slate roofs. They're very solid buildings.
So has Carnegie's reputation changed over time? I know you said one community referenced blood money. Do we in the 21st century think of Andrew Carnegie differently than people of his time?
I think so. I think it's a more balanced view. I think at his time, a lot of people viewed him as wanting to buy his way out of purgatory, but I think at this point, people realize he gave away his whole fortune. And part of Carnegie's legacy is not just the library and his donations, it's that what he did made other people up their donation game. I mean, at this period, you see like Rockefellers, they donate the National Park Arcadia. Rosenwald, he gets together with Booker T. Washington and he donates schools for Blacks in the southern part of the United States. Carnegie changes the idea of you just acquire wealth.
Thank you. Do you happen to know what happened to Carnegie's wife after he passed away? I know you said no prenup, but equivalent of $3 million a year. Any info on what she did with the rest of her life?
She lived it pretty quietly. She and his daughter, I mean, they never had money woes. But you don't hear much about her at all once he dies. She keeps the estates and just lives on. I want to say, I haven't looked at this lately, she died maybe in the 1950s. She was significantly younger than him. And the daughter, but to this point, I do not believe, and I could be wrong, that the Carnegies are really still living off his wealth, because he did a pretty good job of giving it away.
Yeah, well, yeah, clearly we can still see the results. One thing that I'm wondering, is it true that Carnegie pronounced his own last name as Carnegie?
He did, but unless you're in Pennsylvania.
I've heard some people pronounce it like that, but I think overwhelmingly you hear Carnegie more often.
Yeah, Well, and the most common misconception about his libraries is that he wanted his name on them, and he didn't. That was not one of his criteria. You
And
could do that, but he did not require it. Um,
that's
and
hilarious that you mentioned that, because I went to Washburn University for my undergrad, and I had a few classes in Carnegie Hall, and I didn't know anything really about it, but I was like, oh wow, what a guy, here's a library, name it after me. So I had that I had that absolute misconception.
no, he didn't. I mean, and he in the United States, he visited almost none of his libraries, which kind of weird because, like in Scotland, England, he went to a lot of the library openings there. I mean, but in the United States, he never did. I have no evidence that he ever stepped foot in Kansas.
That's fascinating.
Yeah,
But I
he, you
guess
know,
he'd have to travel a lot to see the fruits of his labor, I guess.
yeah. Well, he did. I mean, he was always going over to Scotland, but yeah, no reason to think he ever visited any of the libraries in Kansas, including the one in Emporia. Although he did correspond with Anderson's widow.
Well, Christine, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to spread the word about these Carnegie buildings. I hope everyone here has had a great night and can come back, visit us again next month on November 8th, same time, 6:30, to hear Dr. Leo Oliva talk about Cathay Williams, one of the first enlisted female soldiers in the U.S. Army. So from all of us here at Museum After Hours, thanks so much for joining us and have a great rest of your evening.